Hello and welcome to our newsletter video for January 2016. Happy New Year! Presentation Techniques is the latest set of videos I've recorded for Photoshop Creative Cloud. So in this newsletter, perhaps I can plug that set of videos just a little bit by touching on a subject of presentation with regard to textures. Now, a few textures do come with Photoshop when it's installed, but we can also shoot our own textures and use those too. Rock, weathered wood, flaking paint, rusty metal, almost anything that has an interesting texture. Just make sure you save the texture as a Photoshop file and not a JPEG. Now, we can shoot images and use them full size as a texture, as in this picture here. But you'll notice there's 3 copies of this. Here's one where I've reduced the file size to around about half, to 3000 by 2000 pixels, and here I've reduced the size of this to about 800 pixels on the long side, which comes out 500 plus pixels in height. What's just appeared in Bridge is a typical texture filter from Photoshop, and you can see that Photoshop uses them very small. You can see the texture is very tight as well. But you can see it's only 512 by 512 pixels, and they're carefully designed. Because if we wanted to use this texture to fill an image much larger, which is going to be the case almost all the time, then this has to be tiled all over the image, and it's designed so that the edges here are not seen. When we shoot our own, such as the shells and up here the coal, if we do the same thing there is a chance we may see some straight edges. Generally, we can deal with them if we really want to with our clone tool, but if we can avoid them, then it's best to do it. Now, what I've got open in Photoshop here is an image that I'm going to apply some textures to, but I've downsized it to be 1920 pixels on the long side, 1080 pixels high. This is HD resolution. The reason I've done that is because over the years I've discovered that if we're going to move away from photo quality by adding textures and filters, then generally speaking, there are always exceptions of course, but generally speaking, a lower resolution image actually works better. So I'm going to click OK to this and we'll make a start. I'm going to begin by changing this image into a smart filter. Let me go to my filters menu and convert for smart filters. Nothing appears to happen, but if we go over to the layers, and I'll lock the layers out so you can see them, you'll notice that we've got that little symbol on the bottom right corner. In other circumstances we may hear this referred to as a smart object. It's going to allow us to apply a texture and go back in and change it quickly and easily, and also work in a non-destructive way. I'm going to go to my filters menu and choose Texture and Texturizer. On the right hand side here we generally get to see 4 textures that come with Photoshop: brick, burlap, canvas and sandstone. Let me just quickly apply the burlap 200%. You can see I need the scaling at its maximum, and yet we're using a lower resolution image. If I were to bring up the canvas, for example, the maximum scale I can get is that. You can imagine if that was a tighter weave than that, it would start to look a little bit wrong. So let me just go back to burlap for a moment, click OK to open it up. The layer now looks a little bit different. Now, the 2 main things we've got here to help us is the fact that we've got a layer mask. When I select it, it becomes framed, so we can see we're working on the mask. We may not need a mask with this particular image, but whenever we apply textures and filters to images that contain people's faces, particularly if those faces are small on screen, they can be distorted and look quite grotesque. Now in that case, it's very useful to be able to bring back a little bit of the original with a layer mask. Now I can demonstrate that quickly in the sky by moving to my toolbox. I've got black as my foreground colour. Here I've just got a soft edge brush which I'll make extra large. I'll push my flow way up to 100%. Normally we would work a little bit more delicately, but I just want to demonstrate how in one strategic spot I can remove the texture, or I'll just hit Ctrl Z. If I did drop the flow down to be really delicate, I could just take a little bit of that texture off in certain locations, and you can see that is so slow or so low we can hardly tell the difference. Let me try 5% and you start to see how I'm affecting the texture, and if I keep brushing, of course I will take the texture away completely. And of course we know the benefit of layer masks. Let me push my flow back up to 100%, because if we want to change our mind or correct a mistake, we can just switch to white and we can repair the mask, because we're never actually erasing anything, of course, just masking it. The other great advantage to smart filters is this option here, because if I double click it, we're straight back into our textures. And what I'm going to do now is select one of those that I've shot myself. We'll choose the shell one and the low resolution one. So up here we've got this little block of lines. Just click and load a texture. Now you'll have to navigate to where the textures are, but once you go there once, of course, Photoshop will know where you're going. So if I go down here, I want my shells. You can see as well it's a good idea to name these so you can tell exactly what they are when you're looking at thumbnails like these. So I'll pick up the shells at 800 pixels, and there you can see it instantly applied. But it's applied. Let me push the relief up a little bit. You may find that with your own textures you may need a little more relief than you were usually applying in Photoshop. But you can see the scaling here is 200%. I can go down the bottom left and drop the size down if you want to see it in its entirety, and now you can start to see evidence of where the tiling isn't quite working. Can you see that straight line? Now if I was able to move the scaling further to the right, which I'm not, I could lose that line. So here we would have to deal with it. Of course I'll push the relief up a little more just so you can get a good idea of what we're doing, and click OK, and there's the texture applied which we just shot from the beach. Now if you look carefully you can see the line where the texture has had to be tiled, and actually there's one right down the bottom running the full length. Can't see one over the left hand side, so that looks like the edge. So let's take a look at the same texture but a slightly bigger one, which is 3000 pixels, because if our image is 1920 pixels then 3000 pixels is going to cover it. So if I double click the texture, I can load it. The one I want is Shell's lower res, and I can click OK. Now straight away at 200%, let me drop the size down a bit, you can see the texture is a little bit big. Now I've got some limits now, because if I come down too low, what I'm going to do is probably introduce those straight edges again, because I'm going to be bringing the texture down smaller than the image. There, I can just see it coming in. Can you see that line down there? So here, if I just move that a little bit to the right, you'll see, if I can pick it up, you'll see the line disappear off screen. So when I get to a setting of around 65% with that particular texture, I've got no issues of tiling at all. Now I've just got to decide on the relief, and we're done. Now we may as well do the full set and get a feel for how the small texture is going to work, the medium size and the one that's 6000 pixels. So let's once again Texturizer, load the texture. Shell's high res is what I need this time. Maybe a little delay as it appears on the screen. Let's drop the size down. Now we've got the scaling very low. Now we can push the scaling up, but if I go down at its lowest, that's as low as I can possibly get. So I cannot get it any smaller than that. And of course we'd need to adjust the relief, but I could get it huge if there was a need to do that. But as you can see, when I do so, we start to lose the charm of the texture itself. So I suppose it's a judgment call. Whenever we open up a texture filter that we want to use, we've got the option to make it small, medium and large. I think a lot of the time it works more efficiently when it is smaller, 500 to 600 pixels square, but of course we may have to deal with those straight edges. But you'll find your clone tool will deal with that pretty effectively. Let's take a look at one of the other textures using this image, just a change of scenery. I'm going to go to my filters menu and convert it to smart filters, then filter, texture, texturizer. Go to my loader texture, and as you can see it's naturally going to where I want it to be now. I'm looking for the coal, not entirely appropriate I would guess as a texture for boats, but nevertheless let's select it, and there you can see with the high resolution coal we can hardly see anything. So here we're going to be bringing that scaling way down and the relief up to be able to view exactly the texture we want to use. Let's click OK for a moment and you can see exactly what it does. A little bit too big on this particular occasion, but that's the nature of the work we're doing. We win some and we lose some, but it does give me the opportunity maybe to demonstrate that mask a bit more effectively. Selecting the mask, I can select black as my foreground color and my brush. Soft edge brush is what I'm using. I'm going to zoom into that front sail because let's assume it's a part of the image we want to remove the texture from. You'll notice at the top of the screen I've got 100% opacity and 100% flow. So I'm just going to click and hold the shift key and work my way up the sail, because all I'm doing is removing the texture in that strategic location. But what I wanted to demonstrate is how quick and easy that is. I'll go over this bit here freehand. I'm working quick and dirty here because I don't want to take up too much time, and then once I get the edge done, of course I can move inside and mask a bit more freely. But the upshot is within just a minute or so, probably less than that, we've got the texture removed from a strategic location. So in some respects it reminds me a little of that strategic color where we have color coming out through a monochrome image. Well, here we could do a similar thing, but we could use the texture instead of the monochrome. I'm going to open up my coal texture. I'm going to do that from Bridge. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to reduce the size. I'm actually going to crop it in a moment, but I'm going to reduce the size first because I want to keep all of the detail in there. So image, image size, and what I want to do is to make the height 512 pixels. You can see the width comes out at 768. Let's click OK to that. I'll hit Ctrl-0 to open it up again. Then I'm going to pick up my crop tool and I'm going to put in here 512 pixels, which is the size Photoshop uses, 512 pixels in the height. You can see what I'm doing. I'm trying to keep as much of the coal within this shape, but I want to go to 512, 512. So there we have it. And it's looking a bit soft because it should be that size. Now, File, Save As. I'll call this one Coal 512. And saving it as a Photoshop file, I'll remove it from the screen. Now let's have a look at applying it to our boats. So double click the texturizer once again, load the texture, Coal 512, there we can see the difference. But if you look very carefully here, you can start to see evidence of the squares that have been added. Now if we scale it up a bit, you may see them more or less, but of course sometimes the textures we apply are pretty delicate. So let's apply this in a reasonably delicate way and click OK. But we can just about see the hint of the lines, but whether that's going to be enough to affect the quality of your image, I think that's going to be a personal call. After all, we are applying a texture. So let's say you had a line you wanted to try to do something about. Let's zoom in to the top there, because I think I can see a line down there. If I were to pick up my clone tool, which I seem to feel is better for this, I get a no entry sign. The reason I'm getting that is because I'm trying to work on what is in effect a smart object, or in this case a smart filter. I've got two choices. I could save this as a Photoshop file, then go to the right of the thumbnail, right click and rasterize the thumbnail, which in effect would take away the smart filter status. The other alternative, if I'm not sure yet whether I'm completely finished, is to apply a new blank layer over the top of the image, pick up my clone tool, and from the options at the top of the screen, make sure you select current and below. Generally, it will be defaulted to current layer. So with current and below, it enables me to sample and clone from this layer to this layer. So I'm not even applying anything here that can't be quickly dropped in the bin. So if I make my brush quite small, I'm using the square bracket keys, but doesn't seem to want to do it for some reason. That's better, it's working now. I'm going to hit the Alt key and sample close by, and I can just paint down these areas. The trick with the clone tool, of course, is changing the sample point quite a bit, but you can see it doesn't take too long before we could quickly merge any of those lines if they were obtrusive and the texture was one that you liked. And of course you've got all of the repairs on that layer, so if it goes wrong you can drop it in the bin. So if you're out with the camera shooting textures, there is one bit of advice I can suggest. Keep as far away from the texture as you can. In other words, cram as much detail into the frame as you can. Looking at the wood at the top right, this one, generally speaking, is not going to work as effectively as these two, because these have been taken with a lot more detail within them, and then the texture seems to work better. I'm sure we'd find one project where this would work best of all, but generally speaking, keep your textures quite tight. And if you look at the Photoshop example down here, you can see how tight they make theirs. But we can do that with most of the subjects we shoot, as long as we can back away far enough.